Hi, welcome to the session today. So we're going to be continuing on our unit, which is communication skills for business 3.26, and we are looking at covering the learning outcome 3 today, which is use appropriate written styles and methods to be able to send across formal communication or official communication across to an organization or a business. I think just a quick recap in terms of what we covered last time with regards to the learning outcome 2 was we looked at the various styles in which you write to different audiences, and this could be done using verbal oblique non-verbal communication. Predominantly when we looked at different types of communication, we classify them as verbal, non-verbal, written communication, and also communication can happen through body language. But in learning outcome 2, we specifically focused on how do we communicate orally, specifically in a business situation. And when we looked at some of the methods in terms of how do we communicate, we looked at methods like when we discussed the handout which was shown to you. We looked at certain methods which included communicating in writing. That means we write a letter, an email, maybe an article. We also looked at certain other forms of communication. Sometimes when we apply for a job, we send across a CV with a covering letter. That's an official and a formal form of formal type of written communication. And we also looked at how do we communicate verbally. Sometimes when you attend training and development seminars, or you go across to a particular function wherein you see an orator or a master of ceremonies actually speaking to you, and he or she is actually speaking to you in a formal language, formal business language, and that is where you get to hear maybe a speech, or you get to hear maybe you get to interact within a training and development seminar, and that is again a formal form of communication. But we have looked at it from a point of view of verbal communication. Now, in this session, what we are trying to look at is primarily concentrate on understanding how do we look at using formal communication, but the context is writing. So what is the appropriate medium that we choose, and how do we write formally when we are looking at communicating some sort of information to colleagues, peers, staff members, or even members of family sometimes, when we are looking at using the aids to try and communicate. So for example, we might make a PowerPoint presentation. We use the technology as an aid in terms of using the software and a projector. And in some cases, what we also use is we use a number of pictures or diagrams when you have to give across complex information like financial data. Sometimes some of these informations are portrayed across from a easier point of understanding to the users or to its consumers, using the various types of graphs or charts or diagrams. So let's very briefly look at this learning outcome 3, and what I want to be able to do is concentrate on 3 or 4 different types. One is letters. When do we write letters? How do we write letters? You look at memos. When you send across memos, sometimes senior members of the team or management people in the team actually send across memos and emails, and that is what we will look at. Now, the reason why we classify, when we look at writing communication for business purposes, these are the 3 generic types that we end up using more often than other form of written communication. So letters, memos, and emails. Now, they typically are kind of they can also have certain other notes or covering notes in addition to being the main body of the communication. For example, when you send across a resume or a CV for an interview, what you do is you wrap it up in a covering letter, and that typically tends to be a summary or a synopsis of what you're trying to actually send across is neatly summarized in that covering letter. Similarly, when you look at emails, the whole idea of putting subjects onto the emails is to try and define the overall message which is being sent across in the email, and that's why you end up writing subjects. Now, when we write or choose these mediums for written communication, we do so from 2 angles. One is we look at the audience to which we are writing, and second, what is the purpose of using these written forms of business communication in terms of formal routes. Now, letters are normally written when we look at sending some information across, which is formal notice or those kind of information across within an organization. They are generally always having a signature or an ink to say that they have been personalized, and obviously it's been signed off by a senior member of the administration before they are sent. Now there is obviously there's an art. Letter writing is considered an art, and when we talk about this, there's a bit of a saying which I would like to talk about, is that the art of letter writing basically emphasizes on the practical application of your rhetoric rather than theoretical considerations, and it tries to put this into practical orientation by emphasizing the point which is being made in the entire letter or in the entire medium. Now, that is to say, if I simplify this, when you write a letter, you write it in three parts. A story, like a story, it has a beginning, it has a mid, and it has an end. So the whole idea of writing a letter is to kind of ensure that some action is taken, because this is one of the highest or the most formal part of business communication. And once you receive a letter, say for example you receive a notice, you receive a parking fine ticket from the council, or you receive something which is coming through in the post as a written form of communication, then this is considered a serious enough case for you to look at some sort of an immediate action. Now, when we talk about memos are normally similar form of written communication, but they are more informal, or they have less formality around it. That means sometimes what happens is, when you're working within a department, you will see a lot of line managers, department managers, your boss might send you a small memo saying that could you do this, could you do that, and they are basically shorter form or versions of letters that you normally get to see, which are written in the form of which are predominantly used in the form of business communication. Now, when we look at emails, what we do see is this is considered in the earlier times, when it was a new medium of communication, written communication, it was considered to be a less formal medium. But over the years, what has happened is some of the things which are sent across in the email, are more or less taken as formal confirmations. So sometimes you will receive an email which will say that this email does not need to be signed, or this particular notice does not need to be signed. Mentioned in the email is because this is now considered by businesses as more or less a formal form of communication. Now, there are lots of softwares that we get to see when we use some of these technological mediums to communicate, like emails, faxes. There are ways where we can spell check the grammar, and some of these things can be looked at as an aid, which is a technological aid to ensure that the communication that we do is grammar and error free. Now, there are different types of letters and memos which can be written. Some of them are listed on the slide, and they would look at letters like inquiry letters, response letters, letters which could be looking at claims, adjustments, or refusals. Now, could you think of an example wherein we talk about a claim letter? So, for example, in the recent news, we've been hearing about the payment protection insurance, and some of these notices or letters coming through from the agencies to help you claim back. The PPI is basically a form of a letter, which is a letter which allows you to make a claim. Sometimes you apply for an insurance, or you apply for an interview, and you get a refusal letter, or a letter that says that you have been unsuccessful, would kind of have a tone in that, which will mean that you've not made it, or they're apologetic, or it's unfortunate that you've not made it for the interview. Some of the letters you send across in formal form or medium could be when you're inquiring about the prices of a house or a premium item that you're looking at buying. You normally would send across, or the buyer or the seller essentially would invite written form of communication in the form of an inquiry sent across in the post from serious buyers only, and that could be a form of a inquiry letter. So let's look at some of the things that we incorporate on a day-to-day basis when we look at sending or writing formal communication using written mediums. So one of the things that we need to look at is when we want to write or convey some message or information, we need to always consider the audience and the purpose of why we are writing that. So email, when we write, we have to be, depending on who you're writing to and what is the message in that email. Sometimes you have to be respectful, friendly, and professional. Sometimes you're writing a complaint email, you have to be firm, formal, and demanding, but not threatening. So these are things that we look at when we look at paying attention to tone. Now, the other thing that we want to look at is, sometimes we use first person language or a third party language. Now in that case, depends on how you're writing, what is the tone of your writing. You make use of you, I, we within the email or in the form of written communication. So sometimes when you have to send across congratulatory messages, you look at saying congratulate and thank you for your contribution. So the emphasis is on the word you. Sometimes when you send information across and you're asking someone in the office or the colleagues not to do this, then you'd say do not use this, as this will give you some bad experience. So again, the use of the word you can change depending on the situation and the tone in which you are writing to the audience. Now sometimes you have to look at dovetailing some of your comments, like we get to hear the saying wherein you have to say, sometimes you have to give a pill which is hard to swallow, but you have to make it or send it in a way wherein it becomes it's not a hard pill to swallow, but it becomes it becomes easy for someone to digest that information. So that is here what we have to look at is when we communicate, we have to be very, very careful that our words that we use in the written form of communication do not have any ambiguity, and they are not having intended outcomes, but they are quite firm and formal in terms of when you send that across. Now sometimes you have to look at when you write, when you're sending a notice, or when you're sending, say for example, sometimes when you send across a written communication, you have to give a purposeful introduction. Sometimes this happens is because you have to explain the context of the scenario in terms of why this has been done or why you're receiving this letter. So in certain cases like parking fines, or when you receive a letter from the council, or if you've applied for benefit and that's been refused, you normally see that there is a bit of a brief purposeful insight given into why your claim was not accepted or why your information was not accepted. Now, when you also look at reviewing the context. Sometimes, when you're telling a long story, you end up emphasizing, the main part of that story again in order to reinforce the message. And sometimes you have to look at reviewing the context. Now, the context is because you might be saying something which is quite, used quite frequently, and that is where you have to kind of review the context so that readers who get that get that form of communication do not or are not very familiar. So in this case, an example would be if you buy a product and you receive a user's manual in the product, the manufacturers or the people who write the copy for the user's manual have to write it in such a way that they have to assume that people who are going to be using it are going to be using it for the first time. So it has to be in a user-friendly or in a language which is very easily understood by the user. Now, sometimes you also have to look at, you have to give a bad news, but you have to dovetail it into a bit of a warning or some sort of a good news. So good news sometimes you have to give, but sometimes people say, do you want the good news or do you want the bad news? So most people end up answering is that they want good news or bad news first and then the good news. So here is where you have to look at the strategy of prioritizing and saying, okay, I need to give this message out first and then kind of soften that message by having something at the back of it. And in that case, it is always a good strategy to provide the good news first, to get your audience to listen to you, to get their attention, and then talk about something which is not going to be born, which the user is not going to kind of come across very friendly with. Now, sometimes you have to look at a reader-centered strategy. That means your message has to be very specific because the type of user, that their psychology and how they feel when they see the message or read the message. So your message sometimes has to be very, very focused in terms of kind of eliciting that response that you want for the message which has been sent across. Now, it is very obvious to say that you have to organize your message into logical paragraphs so that you have a context to the message that you're sending. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to have, if you're going to send across something in writing, you have to have a story which reads like a story. It has a beginning, mid, and end. And sometimes you have to emphasize parts of those messages which are written in the written message by bolding it, using italics. And those are things which you have to do in order to get the desired attention from the user or from the audience that you're sending it across to. There's also a thing that you keep it short and simple, KISS, which is a term which we normally use. You need to give information which is necessary. You do not need to bombard the user with loads of information. Sometimes you have to restructure a message in a way wherein the message has, in the written form has a punch, and obviously it is able to convey what you're trying to convey rather than talk about it. And in that case, some of the important parts of the messages might get lost if the information is not carefully worded in the precise manner. Now, when we look at technology, the idea here is we are looking at things like headings, lists, and tables in order to kind of format, structure the information when you're sending it across in the written form. And this is definitely possible with the use of technology. When you use email editors, when you use PC or a Mac, and when you use technology in terms of giving presentations and things like that, you can structure your messaging in such a way in the written form, which then has appropriate heading, lists, and tables to grab the attention of your audience. Last but not the least, when we look at a couple of other things, what we have to look at is we have to always conclude the message formally, and in some cases, informally. But again, it involves the careful selection of words, and that would tell the reader, will leave the reader with some sort of a message that will tell them that there's a follow-up action which needs to be taken. For example, in most cards or invitations, you normally see RSVP with the address underneath, and the reason why you have RSVP with the address underneath, which is a French word, a short form of French word called "Répondez s'il vous plaît." That means you need to respond. You need to respond to this address by confirming that you'll be attending the function, not attending the function, and you have to give your contact information underneath. And here is what I would summarize in terms of when we look at choosing written communication, when we use letters, memos, and emails, what we have to look at is, I've kind of summarized this on this slide here, wherein we talk about what are the things that you need to pay attention to. So you have to pay attention to the tone. You have to briefly state in the subject if you're writing an email, or a subject in the letter saying that what is the purpose of the letter, email, or a memo. You have to review the context. That means sometimes you have to write the message and repeat it in a subtle way so that the reader or the audience who are receiving it are able to actually follow it. Sometimes you have to say good news first, then followed by the bad news. And sometimes you have to assume a reader-centered strategy, that you have to design things in a way or send things across in a way wherein the people receiving it find it easier to read and comprehend, and obviously then take a follow-up action. And it's least to say that when we send something, when we, even in our daily lives, when we do something, what we tend to do is we always organize things in a structured manner. And the reason of organizing these things is to ensure that there is a structure to the written form of communication, and the message that you're trying to get across to your audience is easily understood, and it leaves no ambiguity. So here is where what we look at, kind of understanding that how do we communicate business information in writing. When we communicate, we use appropriate written form of business styles and methods. And last but not the least, when we communicate complex information, we also have to look at the tone and the audience to which this has been sent across, so that it is able to elicit an appropriate response from your audience in terms of follow-up in regards to that communication. So technology is used. When we look at email as an example, email editors are used in order to kind of bold, italic, put some headlines, color the message, or in a way wherein you include pictures and diagrams sometimes when you have to give complex information across. Now this brings across, this kind of brings us to the end of this particular unit, which is communication skills for business. And we've covered all the 3 learning outcomes. What I'm going to do is, after the session, try and send you a handout which will cover the learning outcome 3 for a bit of more reading. And the idea would be to try and then start doing a draft of the assignment, and then we will skip on to the last unit in this particular course, which is academic skills for business, and that will take up next week. Thanks so much for joining this session today. And if you have any questions, queries, as always, please email, send them across to me on email. Thanks. Bye.